Hello there. Okay, so today we are doing something a little bit different. You guys are going to be detectives. You're helping out the police department to solve a mystery. It is called the Mountain View Mansion Murder. You have to figure out the mystery. Who done it? So the directions are to watch this video, collect the clues, and then submit your answer. And the answers will be revealed. We'll find out who's correct, who isn't correct um, eventually. So you will know how you did, whether you were a super sleuth or not. So this is the Mountain View Mansion Murder. Here's the story. So what you might want to do as you listen is use the recording sheet to collect evidence as you go along. So write down clues as you listen so that at the end, when you try to solve the mystery, you will have things written down and things to go by so you can kind of rule out suspects or look at evidence to decide who committed the crime. Okay, are you ready? Do you have a pencil? Do you have your evidence collecting sheet ready? All right, here is the story. So, a mystery game, the Mountain View Mansion Murder. It was a dark and stormy night when Mr. Smith invited a few friends over for a party. He had just bought this stunning antique mansion on top of Mountain View Road and wanted his friends to see. Mr. Smith invited 6 friends over to celebrate. They were all close friends of Mr. Smith's, and he trusted all of them. The night began very well. The friends shared drinks and hors d'oeuvres, danced and talked. Mr. Smith was so pleased to see all of his friends together and enjoying his new mansion. As the guests danced and carried on with their night, a shadowy figure was lurking in the hallway. Nobody could have imagined what was coming. In the middle of the merrymaking, the lights went out and everything went black. All of the guests and Mr. Smith stopped what they were doing and shouted for an explanation. Mr. Smith, where is the fuse box? We need to get these lights back on, said Mr. Alfaro. It's around the back behind the pool house. I'll go check it out, said Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith left the room to examine the fuse box. When he didn't return after 30 minutes, the guests began to worry. Miss Singleton suggested that somebody check on him. Mr. Mack and Mr. Bennet agreed. They went around to the pool house, and what they found was a shock. Mr. Smith was lying on the floor, unconscious and lifeless. So what you guys can do anytime you need to, you can go back and rewind this and look at this again. So feel free to do that. You can pause the video at any time as well. Okay. So what you need to know. So your job, is to figure out who killed Mr. Smith. So what you need to know, Mr. Smith is dead. The location is Dixie Springs, a quiet and close-knit community. And it's at Mr. Smith's house, right? And you also need to know that the police believe that Mr. Smith has been poisoned. So they've already done some investigating and they believe Mr. Smith has been poisoned. Okay, so let's collect clues. So now let's see, what did the police find when they collected clues and evidence about Mr. Smith's case and about Mr. Smith? So let's read it. Remember, you write down evidence as you find it, write down things that seem important, and you can pause this at any time. You can rewind it as well. So the victim, Mr. Smith. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Mr. Smith, the victim. Mr. Smith was an admired and wealthy man. He had just bought this stunning antique mansion on the top of Mountain View Road, and he wanted his friends to see it. Mr. Smith invited 6 friends over to celebrate. Mr. Smith lived alone. He was not married and did not have any children. Mrs. Reed is his cousin. Mr. Smith did not like Mrs. Reed. He only invited her to his party because he knew that if he didn't, she would spread bad rumors about him. When the lights went out, the guests were in the lounge, dancing and playing pool. Mr. Smith went to the fuse box in the dark to try and fix the lights. Okay, so make sure you write down anything that might be significant here. Okay. So the suspects, let's learn about the suspects. Again, you want to see what you find out about each of them, see what we know about each of them, and be jotting down things that seem important to help you solve the murder. So we have Miss Singleton, Mrs. Swanson, Mrs. Reed, Mr. Alfaro, Mr. Bennett, and Mr. Mack. So let's start with Mrs. Swanson. So when the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Mrs. Swanson. Mrs. Swanson was very fond of Mr. Smith and enjoyed his company. Mrs. Swanson and Mr. Smith were seen together just before the lights went out. Okay, Miss Singleton. So when the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Miss Singleton. Miss Singleton was the town flirt. She loved to go on dates and meet new people. Mr. Smith was her next target. Before the murder happened, Miss Singleton noticed that a candlestick had been missing from a shelf in the lounge. Miss Singleton saw Mr. Alfaro pour Mr. Smith a drink. Are you collecting clues and writing down suspicious evidence? Make sure you continue to do that. Okay, now Mrs. Reed. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed believed that because Mr. Smith had no children and no wife, she would inherit his wealth because she was the closest relative. Mrs. Reed had invited Mr. Alfaro to the party. She thought it would be good for Mr. Smith to meet new people in town. And Mrs. Reed spent a lot of time with Mr. Alfaro at the party. They never left each other's side. Keep thinking. Okay, now Mr. Alfaro. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Mr. Alfaro. Mr. Alfaro was the town's pharmacist. Mr. Alfaro was a discreet and timid man. Mrs. Reed had invited Mr. Alfaro to the party. Mrs. Reed spent a lot of time with Mr. Alfaro at the party. They never left each other's side. Mr. Alfaro asked Mr. Smith about the fuse box and getting the lights back on. Is anyone seeming suspicious to you? Make sure you're writing down your evidence. Okay, now we have Mr. Bennett. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett was a colleague of Mr. Smith's and worked closely with him. He lived 2 miles down the road from Mr. Smith. Mr. Bennett always carried a pocket knife on him. Mr. Bennett did not like Mr. Mack. He thought he was a greedy and conceited man. He told Mr. Smith to keep his distance. Mr. Bennett was the first to find Mr. Smith's body. Okay. You like my music? All right, Mr. Mack finally is our last suspect. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Mr. Mack. Mr. Mack was a new friend of Mr. Smith's. They had recently met when Mr. Smith used him as a realtor to buy his new mansion. Mr. Mack had been seen leaving the lounge 5 minutes before the lights went out and didn't return until after the murder was discovered. Mr. Mack was very fond of the old mansion that Mr. Smith bought. Okay, so the police believe they found the killer and brought him or her into headquarters under arrest. Do you know who it is? What is your guess and why? So what you want to do when the video stops is to choose the person you think is guilty and then provide evidence to support your answer. I will reveal the answer. I will reveal who was correct. But make sure you go back over your evidence, rewind and rewatch anything that you feel you need to, and make an educated guess. Don't forget to not just guess who it is, but explain why you think it is that person. What is your evidence? So support your guess with evidence from your clues and what you have gathered, okay, of why you think this person is the killer. Before you guess, remember a few things. Remember the cause of death. Not all evidence that was collected was meaningful or pertinent to the case. Sometimes it's put in there to throw you off. And don't jump to conclusions. You can't arrest someone because you think they are guilty. There needs to be justifiable reason that make them seem guilty. Who has motive? For example, just because someone was acting strange doesn't mean they did anything. Maybe they're just strange. Okay? So, who do you think killed Mr. Smith? And what is your evidence? So, you're going to click on your teacher's link to their Google form and fill that out. Good luck. Make sure you go back over all of your evidence before you decide and rewatch and re listen if needed. Good luck.